Let's move on to question number 2. How does a React application start up? This is really a 3-step process. Let's go through each step very quickly, and again, this is really just a summary. We're going to go into more detail on all this over time. A typical React project is going to have many different small JavaScript files inside of it. It's usually inefficient to send a bunch of small files to a user's browser. So usually we take all of our different project files and combine them into one file. We usually refer to it as the bundle.js file, and it's also called the app bundle. In reality, this thing is not actually called bundle.js. It's usually got some identifier tied to it, like so. But again, we call it bundle.js or app bundle. It contains all the code for your entire application. Once that bundle has been created, it's then placed on a server where users can access it from their browser. So on step number 2, we've got our server over here. Here's the bundle.js file down there. Eventually, a user is going to type in the address to your website inside the address bar. That's going to send off a request to your server. Your server is going to immediately respond with a HTML file. We usually call it the index.html file. So every React project, even though we're writing JavaScript to generate HTML, every React project is still going to have an HTML file tied to it. This file is going to be loaded up inside the browser. This file usually does not have a lot of content inside of it. Usually it just has a couple of tags, like script tags or link tags, that tell the browser that it needs to go and fetch some additional JavaScript files from the server. So the browser will make a second request off to the server and get that bundle file that we just discussed a moment ago. That will be sent back in response. It'll be loaded up inside the browser and then executed. You can find the HTML file that is tied to our translate application back inside of Code Sandbox very easily. So back inside of Code Sandbox, I'm going to find the public directory, and inside there is index.html. So this is the HTML file that is tied to our React application. It gets loaded up first, and inside of here there is a script tag that says do an additional load of some JavaScript that contains our actual React application. On to step number 3. So this is where the browser actually executes our code. Here's the index.html file that we just looked at a moment ago. Inside there, inside the body, there's a single element that has a div with an ID of root. Inside of our bundle.js file, there's also a snippet of code that looks like this right here. You can find that snippet of code inside the index.js file inside the src directory. So here's the 3 lines we're about to talk about. Those 3 lines of code are going to tell React how. Before we move on to step number 3, there are 2 things I want to show you very quickly back inside of our Code Sandbox project. The first thing I want to show you is inside of the public directory. Inside there is the index.html file. So this is the file that is tied to our React project. It is what gets sent down to our preview window whenever we try to see our application as we are developing it. So inside this preview window is all the HTML that you see inside of this file. Inside this HTML file, you can scroll down towards the bottom. Down here, we're going to find a body element right there. And then inside there is a div with an ID of root. So just keep that in mind for a moment. The other thing I want to show you very quickly, inside the src directory is a file called index.js. This is the first file that gets executed when our project first starts up. Inside of here, I just want you to take a look at line 6, 7, and 9 very quickly. We're going to discuss what these lines of code do in just a moment. Okay, so back over to our diagram. So here's step 3. Here's what happens when that index.html file and the bundle.js file have been loaded up inside the browser. So inside a bundle is the code that we just saw inside of index.js. Here's those 3 lines of code I just pointed out. Here's the HTML file, and here's that div with an ID of root. So here's what occurs during the React startup process. The first thing that happens is we run this first line of code right here. This line of code gets a reference to that div with ID of root. So we just get a reference to that element right there. In step number 2, we run this line of code. This tells React that we want it to take control of that div right there, and we want it to eventually render our application into that div element. So that's step number 2. And then in step number 3, we are telling React that we want it to render our app component and show all the JX from it, take that JSX, turn it into HTML, and show it inside of that div right there. So that's what's going on. that's the three-step process. Let's just go over it once again very quickly. We bundle together all of our files. We send down an index.html file and the bundle to the user's browser. And then we run these three very special lines of code to get a reference to a div. We then tell React to take control of that div, and then we render the app component into it. Once again, we're going to go into more detail in this process over time. On to question number 3. What were those useState functions? Now, just in case you didn't see them, I'm referring to the 2 function calls we added into the app component as we built out the translation app. So here's one useState, and here's another right here. I only bring these up because they've got some weird syntax around them, specifically those square brackets. So what are these things all about? All right, here we go. The useState functions that you just saw are tied to React's state system. The state system is kind of like a variable in the world of React. We make use of state to store data that is going to change over time as a user interacts with our application by clicking on things, typing on things, and so on. Anytime that we update state, React is going to automatically update the content that is displayed on the screen. Now, the state system is one of the most complicated aspects of React. So for right now, I just want to give you a little bit of a taste, just something to think about. Our application, the Translate one, had 3 pieces of data that were going to change over time as a user interacted with our application. And those were the text that the user typed into the text input, the language that the user wanted to translate the text into, and then the actual translation result. These were 3 distinct pieces of data, and anytime a user interacted with our application in some way, one of these things would probably change. And anytime they changed, we wanted to update what was displayed on the screen. So we can find a single call to the useState function to set up each of these pieces of data. Let me show you all 3 of them. So back inside of the app component, the first call to useState right here sets up the state system and says that we're going to have some kind of selected language that is going to change over time. The second one is tied to the text that the user types into this text input. And then you can find the third call to useState inside the components translate.js file. If you open up that file and scroll down a little bit, you'll see another useState call right there. That one is tied to the actual translated result that gets displayed at the bottom of the screen. Once again, the state system is a little bit confusing. We're going to get a lot of practice with it. On to our last question. This one is the kind of easiest to answer here, I'd say. How did we actually do the translation? Well, for this, we were feeding in 2 pieces of data, the actual text from the input and the selected language into the translate component. That component was set up to watch for those 2 values to change. And anytime they change, it would make a network request to a Google Translate API. This is an API that can be used to translate text from one language into another. Once the translate component got a response from that API, it then displayed the result on the screen. And that was the actual translated result that we saw at the bottom of the application. All right, that's it. Answers to all 4 questions. At this point, I do not expect you to memorize or be a master of anything we've discussed so far. I just want to give you a high-level overview on some of the major topics in React that we're going to be discussing. For every topic we've covered so far, we're going to have a tremendous amount of additional discussion, practice, applications, and so on.